The land out west didn't whisper. It groaned. The earth cracked under hooves and the wind held its breath in the cottonwoods. Out where fences gave up and graves grew lonely, a man rode alone, his coat threadbare, his boots weather-beaten, and his eyes set far ahead, as though chasing something long gone. He was about 35, and folks called him a widower, though no one knew his name anymore. He didn't speak it, and no one asked. 3 winters back, he'd buried a woman beneath the juniper tree behind a lean-to shack, her grave marked with a single stone and the smooth curve of a cradle that never rocked. Since then, he'd spoken little and ridden slow, as if afraid to outrun her memory. That morning, he rode into town under a sky that looked bruised. The sun was low but hot enough to bake the dust into crust. A few men leaned on their porches, boots up, eyes shaded. They nodded at him like you do to a storm cloud, respectfully, with distance. He tied his horse outside the general store, adjusted his hat, and stepped down into the street where the world felt dry enough to shatter. From the edge of the square came noise, sharp, mocking, tinged with cruelty. Laughter that didn't quite laugh, but spat. He turned his head. A crude platform of wagon planks had been built in front of the saloon. On it stood 2 girls, about 15 if he had to guess, barefoot, with burlap sacks tied down over their heads and hands bound in front of them like cattle. The taller one's dress was torn at the hem. The smaller one had a swollen bruise along her ankle. Neither moved. The seller was a couple from somewhere east, all grime and bitter stares. The woman chewed the inside of her cheek like she was holding back hate. The man, bearded, round-shouldered, full of stale sweat and rust, shouted over the crowd. 2 of 'em. Strong backs. No trouble yet. If they speak, it's nonsense. Quiet as ash. Startin' at $5 the pair. No one raised a hand. A man near the livery spat in the dirt. Another chuckled and muttered something about demons in girlskin. A boy tossed a pebble. It hit the taller one in the shin. She didn't flinch. He hadn't meant to stop. He had flour to buy. Salt, maybe. But something about how still they stood, like forgotten gravestones, held him. $4, the seller shouted now. Take 'em both. Got no names, no papers, nothin' to run back to. Still no one moved. The crowd began to thin. And then the widower cowboy stepped forward. He didn't speak. Just reached into his coat, pulled out silver, clean, heavy coins, and dropped them onto a crate without counting. The man blinked. You buyin' 'em? He asked, half laughing. The cowboy nodded once. Both? Another nod. The seller grinned like he'd won a prize he didn't deserve and shoved the rope into the cowboy's hand. Hell, they're yours, mister. Don't say I didn't warn ya. The cowboy didn't answer. He just gave a slight tug on the rope. The girls stepped off the platform without stumbling. Still no sound. Still no resistance. They walked behind him like shadows, their heads covered, their hands bound together with one rough knot. He didn't speak to them. Didn't turn to look. He untied his horse and rode slow, letting them follow behind on foot, dust rising up around them like old sorrow. By the time the sun began to bleed red into the hills, they reached the edge of his land. The cabin sat crooked, weather-worn, roof patched with mismatched boards. A porch sagged under the weight of silence. Fences leaned as though tired of standing. He opened the door. It creaked like it remembered joy once, long ago. Inside, it was plain. One narrow bed, a cold stove, a small table with 2 chairs. He cleared a spot on the floor by laying out an old quilt and set 2 chipped bowls on the table. Beans. Stale bread. Water from the well. He gestured. They didn't move. For a long while, the girls stood near the wall, burlap still on their heads, hands bound. He didn't push them. He sat, ate his meal in silence, then lit the lamp and leaned back in the chair. The room flickered with firelight. Wind tapped the walls. One of the girls whispered something to the other. A sound like a leaf turning in late fall. He didn't catch it. Didn't try. Before he slept, he placed a 3rd blanket near the quilt. Just in case. Morning broke soft and colorless. A gray sky held its weight above the land, and birds stayed quiet. He stepped outside to split wood. The axe thunked into the stump like a steady heartbeat. Behind him, he heard a scuff. When he turned, the girls stood just beyond the doorway. The sacks were still on, but their hands were no longer tied. They'd cut the rope sometime in the night. Left it neatly coiled beside the hearth. He didn't move. Just met their gaze, what little of it he could see through the fabric, and nodded once. They didn't nod back. But they didn't run either. The day passed slow. He hauled water. Fixed a hole in the barn roof. Fed the horse. Occasionally, he caught a glimpse of them moving like whispers through the edge of his vision, one gathering kindling, the other sweeping dust from the porch with a pine branch. At dusk, he carved something from cedar, small, careful strokes. It took shape beneath his knife. A horse, crudely done, but whole. He set it on the table beside a slice of bread and 2 apples. Then he stepped outside to sit on the porch and watch the stars rise. Somewhere behind him, a floorboard creaked. By morning, the horse carving was gone. They still wore the sacks. Still didn't speak. But now they moved like they belonged to the space they filled. He didn't ask them questions. He didn't call them names. He didn't pretend to understand what they'd seen, or what had been done. The land had taught him that healing didn't ask permission. It just came quietly, like rain on dust. And still, they stayed. He remembered once, long ago, when he and his wife had spoken about children. She'd wanted them. He'd wanted to keep her safe. In the end, neither wish was granted. Now, he didn't know what he was to these 2 girls, rescuer, jailer, stranger, but something inside him had stirred when he saw them stand so still beneath the laughter of cruel men. That night, just before the fire dimmed low, he heard a soft, scratchy voice say something he couldn't make out. He turned his head. One of the girls had spoken. The smaller one. She repeated it, a little louder. A name. Not hers. The others. She said it like it hurt, but like it needed saying. He didn't reply. Just looked into the fire, nodded once, and said softly, "That's a good name." She stepped back into shadow. The fire hissed. He sat long into the night, the weight of the world less cruel for the first time in years. And outside, the wind carried no judgment, only dust, and the promise of morning. The days unfolded quiet as linen left out in the sun, soft and slowly faded. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, and the sky pressed low over the plains, as though it too held its breath around the cabin with the 2 girls inside. They had not spoken again since the smaller one had whispered her sister's name by firelight. She hadn't said her own, and the man hadn't asked. He moved like a man who knew the danger of asking things not ready to be given. In the morning, they sat on the floor while he boiled oats. They no longer wore the sacks, but they avoided mirrors and his gaze. Their faces were drawn, too pale for girls their age, and their wrists carried the red ghosts of old rope. They didn't flinch anymore when he moved near, but they still froze when the wind slammed the door. He set the bowls on the table and stepped back. They didn't climb up to the chairs, not yet, but they reached for the food without shame. That was new. That was something. He spent the morning mending the fence that ran behind the barn, the posts leaning like drunks after a storm. He didn't ask them to help. But when he looked up, he saw the older girl crouched by the trough, scrubbing it clean with a cloth. The younger one gathered dead leaves into a pile near the gate. He didn't say a word. Just watched. By midday, they sat by the cabin wall, faces turned toward the sun. Their hair caught the light, tangled and unkempt, but shining still. They didn't talk. They just existed in the space they'd been given. Not claimed. Not commanded. Simply allowed. That night, he carved again, this time not a horse, but a sparrow. Small, rounded wings tucked close. When he finished, he placed it on the shelf above the hearth. Neither girl acknowledged it, but in the morning, it was gone. They were watching him more now. Not with suspicion. With something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Or the early edge of trust. He caught them watching when he lit the fire, when he whittled wood, when he folded his late wife's shawl and placed it inside the old trunk like he did every week. Once, while he sat polishing his saddle, the younger girl stepped near the door and pointed at the wide sky. He looked up. A hawk circled far overhead, gliding soundless. The girl didn't speak. Just pointed, then let her hand fall. "Used to be more of those," he said softly. "Before the settlers came." She didn't answer. But she stayed by the door a while longer. Later that week, it rained for hours. The kind of rain that made the roof weep and the earth weep with it. They all stayed inside, the cabin lit only by fire. The girls took turns watching the flames. The older one leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. He moved slow, boiled beans, added dried venison. He left the food out and sat down with his back to them, working a new piece of cedar in his hands. He didn't need the shape yet. Just the motion. Behind him, one of the girls, he could not tell which, began to hum. Low and cracked like a riverbed, but still holding melody. It was a lullaby. One he hadn't heard in years. One his wife had sung, long ago, on nights when the wolves howled and her belly grew round. He set the carving down. Let the sound fill the room. When the song ended, he turned. The younger girl had her knees drawn to her chest. Her chin rested atop them. She didn't look at him, but she said clearly, plainly. She sang it too. The older girl looked at her sharply, but said nothing. "Your mother?" he asked, his voice gentle as smoke. The girl nodded. "Before they took us. Before they gave us away." He didn't speak. He let silence hold the weight. He didn't tell them he was sorry. He didn't ask who they were. He just sat back, leaned into the chair, and said, "She must have had a beautiful voice." The older girl shifted. Her hands were clenched around the hem of her dress. Her throat moved once, but no words came. That night, he gave them the bed. They didn't protest. He laid blankets on the floor beside the stove for himself and watched as they curled beneath the quilt, shoulders pressed together like roots growing from the same trunk. In sleep, they murmured. Fragments of dreams or memory, names, maybe. He didn't listen too hard. Some things weren't meant to be overheard. The next morning, he found the sparrow back on the shelf, but it had a red thread wrapped around its leg. He didn't ask where they'd found the thread. He just smiled and left it there. Later that week, he brought back 2 loaves of bread and a small mirror from town. He left the mirror on the table without comment. It stayed untouched for days, its back turned. But on the 4th morning, it was gone from the table and he found it near the wash basin, wet around the rim. Their silences began to change. Where once they had been heavy, now they seemed contemplative. The younger girl began brushing her hair near the window. The older one asked for a knife with her hand, not in fear, but to help slice potatoes. He gave it to her without a word. The first time he left them alone to ride into town, he was gone 5 hours. When he returned, the cabin smelled of something warm. The girls had boiled apples and left a note. It said, *, we used only the soft ones. Saved the good ones for tomorrow, *. He kept that note in his coat pocket. That evening, when the fire cracked and the wind picked up again, he took a long breath and asked, carefully, "What should I call you?" They sat across from him, small bowls of stew in their laps. The older one looked to the younger, who nodded once. The older girl said her name. Her voice was low, cautious, but clear. Then, after a long pause, she said the younger girl's name too. The same one that had been whispered weeks ago. They were simple names. Soft on the tongue. Names that belonged in lullabies and stitched into the lining of coats. He repeated them, not too loud, not too soft. As if tucking them gently into the walls of the cabin. The girls didn't smile. But they held his gaze a little longer than before. He slept lighter that night, and woke to the scent of fresh bread baking over embers. Trust wasn't a single moment. It was many, stitched together with silence, risk, and time. It was in the returned carving. The used mirror. The lullaby sung again near the fire. It was in names finally spoken, not demanded. And still, they stayed. The fence behind the barn never stood straight. It leaned in places, bowed in others, as though weary from years of holding the world back. He'd meant to fix it properly for some time, but grief had slowed his hands and purpose had thinned in his bones. Now, with 2 quiet girls living under his roof and speaking their names aloud, he felt something in him returning, like spring under snow. He worked with a steady rhythm, post by post, hammering down rails and replacing rotted beams. The older girl, the one with eyes that didn't flinch anymore, joined him without invitation. She carried nails in her apron and passed him the hammer when it slipped. She never spoke while they worked, but her presence filled the silence in a way that didn't demand anything. She watched closely, mimicked his pace. He showed her how to measure the angles with a piece of string, and she caught on quick. The sun lit her hair like the edge of dry wheat, and in that light, she looked less like someone who'd been thrown away. The younger one stayed near the porch, tending to the herbs they'd planted in tin cups. She talked more now, not much, just in pieces, about the wildflowers she'd seen growing near the creek, about a bird she thought might have followed them from town. Her voice had a softness to it, the kind that made you lean in without realizing. He'd begun to mark the days not by the calendar pinned above the hearth, but by their laughter. It came sparingly, sudden as thunder and just as sacred. Once, when he tripped over a crooked plank, the older girl let out a sharp giggle before covering her mouth. He looked at her, surprised, and she blushed, but didn't apologize. That night, he carved a fox, small, sleek, clever-looking, and left it near her cup. In the morning, it was gone, and a stone polished smooth had been placed in its spot. Each evening, after supper, he told them stories. Not grand tales, just quiet ones, about the time he'd chased a mule through a rainstorm, or the time his wife had painted the sky with dye she made from berries. He didn't speak of her often, but the girls listened when he did, their eyes steady and full. One evening, the younger girl asked what her name had been. He paused. "Ellen," he said. She liked the morning best. Said it smelled like possibility. They were silent after that, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was reverent, like they'd been given something precious. Later, the older girl helped him clean out the old shed near the corral. They found a cradle tucked behind a stack of broken chairs. He hadn't known it was still there. Dust clung to every curve, and one leg had been gnawed by mice. He almost turned away, but the girl brushed off the top and traced the edge with her fingers. "Did you build this?" she asked. Her voice startled him, not because she spoke, but because it held no fear. "I did," he said after a pause. "Before the baby came." She looked at him then, not with pity, but with something quieter. Understanding. What happened? She asked. He exhaled, slow. She didn't make it. Neither did the child. She nodded once, then turned back to the cradle. We could fix it, she said, almost like a whisper. He didn't answer right away. But that night, he began sanding the edges. They worked side by side for days. He taught her how to square the legs, how to patch cracks with cedar dust and sap. She didn't ask who it was for. He didn't offer. The rhythm of the days softened into something nearly gentle. The wind turned warmer, and grass returned to the hill behind the cabin. The fence stood straighter. The girls walked with their heads higher. And still, he kept waiting for the world to notice, and ruin it. It didn't take long. Word had spread in town. It always did. Some called him strange. Others whispered filth, said he'd taken them for unclean reasons, said he'd lost his mind. No one came up the hill, but he felt it in the way they looked at him when he rode in for supplies. They stared too long. They muttered. One afternoon, while trading for flour and nails, the storekeeper cleared his throat. Folks been talkin', he said. 'Bout the girls. He didn't respond. Just counted his coins. Sheriff might come by, the man added. Just to ask questions. The cowboy nodded once. Took his goods and left without a word. That evening, he told the girls. Sat them down by the fire and looked at them fully. People might come asking things. Might try to scare you. You don't owe them anything. You just stay close to the truth. The older girl frowned. What truth? That you're here, he said. That you're safe. They didn't speak after that, but they stayed close for the rest of the night. The younger girl leaned against him when the fire grew low. He didn't move. Just let her be. 3 days later, the sheriff rode up with 2 men and a woman from town. He waited on the porch as they dismounted. Got some concerns, is all, the sheriff said. Couple folks worried about the situation. The cowboy nodded. You're welcome to talk. Not to threaten. The woman stepped forward. Her voice was sharp, shaped like righteousness. Those girls belong in a proper orphanage. Not hidden away in some shack with a widower. The cowboy looked at her, slow and steady. They belong to men who put sacks on their heads and sold them like cattle, he said. I didn't hide them. I gave them doors that opened both ways. The sheriff shifted his weight. We just need to speak to them, he said. Behind him, the girls stood in the doorway. Not hiding. Not trembling. Watching. The older one stepped forward. She spoke first. We don't belong to anyone, she said. We're not for sale. And we're not afraid. The younger one followed. He never asked for anything. Just gave us names, and bread, and a place to sleep. The woman from town narrowed her eyes. He's not your father. No, said the older girl, but he's never lied to us. That's more than most. The men didn't know how to answer that. After a few moments, the sheriff nodded. Well, he said. If you ever feel unsafe. We don't, the older girl said. They left after that, boots crunching on dry earth, shoulders tight. That night, the cowboy sat on the porch while the sun bled out behind the hills. The older girl came to sit beside him. For a while, they said nothing. The thing about fences, he said finally, is they can keep danger out. But sometimes, they trap good things in. She nodded. We'll help mend the rest, she said. If you want. He looked at her, his eyes tired but soft. I'd like that. She didn't smile, but she didn't need to. Inside, the fire crackled. The younger girl hummed the lullaby again, not for anyone, just because it was inside her now. And the world, for the moment, stayed quiet. Spring brought green shoots curling through the frost, wildflowers stubbornly threading their way through the cracked earth. The cabin's walls still groaned in the wind, but there was a different sound now, laughter. Soft, occasional, and full of surprise, like the creak of an old gate finally swinging open. The younger girl had taken to drawing on scraps of wood with charcoal. The older one had started reading from Ellen's books, slowly, one finger tracing the letters like footprints in snow. They had carved a life, quiet and small, but whole. And then came the letter. He found it folded beneath his saddle blanket after returning from the creek. Its paper was thin and smudged, sealed with wax that cracked like a dry laugh. The handwriting was fine and firm, not from a local hand. The stamp bore the mark of the Orphan Commission out of Jefferson County. He read it twice, jaw set, eyes narrowing. Someone in town had sent word to the state authorities. A report, concern over 2 orphaned girls housed improperly by a man with no legal claim. The letter was not a request. It was an advance warning, they were coming to take them. He didn't tell the girls right away. He needed time. Time to think, to plan. But time was the one thing life rarely lent. The news came ahead of him, carried like wildfire through back doors and pews. Whispers blew faster than dust. Folks who had once ignored him now stared outright. The preacher wouldn't meet his eye. The shopkeeper gave exact change and nothing else. When he walked the main street, conversations died mid-sentence. At night, he sat on the porch, turning the letter over and over in his hand, the way a man fingers a bullet he knows is meant for him. Inside, the girls continued on, unaware for now, setting the table, braiding twine into small animals, writing their names again and again in a notebook. He wanted to shield them from it. But the wind shifted too soon. One afternoon, a group rode up from town. 5 riders, all settlers, all men. They came not as a mob, but something worse, as neighbors cloaked in judgment, calling it law. He met them halfway between the gate and the porch. "Evenin'," the tallest said, not kindly. "Evenin'," he replied, slow. "We heard the state's comin'. Figured we'd save them the trouble." The girl stood just inside the doorway, watching. The younger one clutched the wooden fox to her chest. The older girl stepped slightly in front of her, chin high. "You ain't talking anyone," the cowboy said, voice even. "Not today." A wiry man with a trimmed beard snorted. "They're not yours, friend. They don't belong here." He didn't look back at the girls. He didn't need to. "They don't belong where they were either," he said. "And they ain't livestock to be handed around." One of the men shifted in his saddle. "You think this is a home? Some broken shack on a dying hill?" "It's more home than they've had," he replied, "and more honest than any of you have offered." The tallest rider dismounted, took a slow step forward. "You're keepin' them like pets. You think that's right?" Before he could answer, a voice rang out. "She's not a pet." It was the older girl, voice low but sharp. She stepped out from the doorway, the sun catching her face full on. Her hair had come loose, and her dress was stained from gathering wild onions. She looked half wild, but unafraid. "She cooks. She reads. She sings when she thinks no one hears her," the girl said. "And I mend fences, fix roofs, and split kindling. You think we're helpless. We're not." The youngest stepped beside her, voice trembling but brave. "We weren't safe till we came here. Not once. Not ever." The men glanced at one another. A few looked away, unsure now. The cowboy remained still, but there was a weight behind him, like stone laid at the foundation of a building. "The kind you couldn't dig out." "You heard them," he said, voice calm but edged. "They're not going anywhere." The men didn't answer. The tallest mounted his horse, face set. "You'll have your day when the wagon comes," he said. "I hope you're ready." They rode off in silence. He watched them go, then turned to the girls. "You all right?" They both nodded. The older one's hands were trembling, but she didn't hide them. "I meant what I said," she told him. "I know," he replied. "So did they. That's why they're angry." That night, he showed them how to pack a satchel fast. He didn't say they were running. Just that being ready was never foolish. They kept their voices low for days. The sound of hooves made their shoulders tense. But nothing came. Not yet. The world grew quiet again, but not safe. The silence was the kind before a storm. He tried not to let them see his worry, but worry sat heavy in the corners of the room, like smoke that wouldn't clear. A week later, the younger girl found him on the porch, carving a small bird with his pocketknife. She sat beside him, knees drawn up. "Do you think we'll have to go?" she asked. He didn't lie. "I think they'll try to make us think we don't have a choice." She leaned her head against his arm. "What if we said no?" He looked down at her. "Then we say it loud. Together." The older girl stepped outside then, carrying the carved sparrow in her hand. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it flies in dreams." He nodded, eyes soft. "Dreams are where flight starts." That night, he lit the fire early. The wind howled through the trees. He stayed up long after they slept, watching the dark as if it could be reasoned with. When the sun rose the next day, no wagons came. No lawmen. Just a breeze, a blue sky, and the slow, steady sound of a family not built by blood, but by choice. He knew the fight wasn't done. That paper still sat in his coat. But he also knew something else now. There was no law stronger than the truth spoken by a brave child. They were not his by birth. He had not chosen them in a church or a courthouse. But he had chosen them at a broken auction yard. And they had chosen him every morning since. Winter came suddenly that year, like a door slamming shut on warmth. The skies turned steel gray, and snow crept down the hills in a hush, burying the grass and silencing even the stubbornest creaks. Wind screamed across the plains at night, rattling the shutters like fists on a coffin lid. The kind of cold that split wood and stung bone. But inside the cabin, something still burned. They kept the fire alive through every storm. He chopped more wood than he thought the stove could hold, while the older girl patched cracks in the walls with wool scraps and clay. The younger one sang to herself as she rolled biscuits, her voice rising softly in time with the smell of heat and bread. The cabin, rough and slanted, glowed golden from within, like a lantern left in the wilderness. He'd never meant to become their father. He didn't call himself that, and they didn't ask him to. But when he looked at them now, one bent over a book, the other dragging a sled of firewood across the snow, he knew something had been given to him, and he had chosen not to return it. The letter from the state hadn't been answered. He'd burned it weeks ago, when the cold first came. Let the paper curl in flame, blackened corners folding like the wings of dead moths. He had no intention of handing the girls over, and no words for those who thought they had more right than he did. But not all threats came with stamps and signatures. They arrived the day after the big freeze, just as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in nearly a week. 5 riders, wrapped in oilskin and pride, their horses churning the snow like waves. No sheriff this time. No townsfolk. These men came from farther east, with polished boots and clipped voices, speaking of state property and court orders. They brought wagons and chain. He was out by the barn when they crested the hill. Saw them cutting through the drift and knew, this wasn't a warning. It was a taking. He met them at the edge of the corral, axe in hand. The girls weren't in sight yet. That gave him seconds, maybe minutes. "Stay off this land," he said, his breath steaming. The man at the lead dismounted. Clean-shaven, long coat. He wore no badge, but the way he held his chin said authority. "We've come for the wards," he said. "By order of Jefferson County and the Bureau of Orphan Welfare." "They're not wards," the cowboy answered. "They're people." "They're minors," the man said flatly. "And you've no legal claim." "I've got something better than claim," he replied. "I've got proof." "Proof?" The cowboy took a slow step forward, eyes calm. "They were bought like cattle. Tied in sacks, bruised and silent. I was there. I saw the hands that tried to erase them." The man frowned. "That's not in the reports." Because no one with a pen cared to ask. Another rider, younger, stepped off his horse. "You're interfering with state business, sir. That's arrestable." He nodded once, slow. "You're on stolen land, after a stolen life, threatening to steal it again. That's worse." Behind him, the cabin door opened. The older girl stood there, a rifle in her hands. It shook, but she held it level. "We're not going back," she said. The younger one stepped beside her, clutching the carved fox. "Not ever." The men shifted. One reached for his holster. Another flinched. But the cowboy didn't move. "They've lived here near a year," he said. "Earned every bite of bread and every breath of peace. You didn't give them safety. You don't get to take it now." The lead man looked between the girls and the cowboy, jaw working. "This is kidnapping," he said at last. "No," the older girl said. "What happened to us before, that was kidnapping. This is home." Something in her voice cracked through the cold. One of the men turned his horse and rode off without a word. Another hesitated, then followed. The leader sighed, eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake." He turned to go, mount already trembling from the cold. "You'll hear from the court," he added, spitting into the snow. But as he rode off, even his boots didn't sound sure. The cabin stayed still long after they disappeared over the ridge. The only sound was the wind curling around the chimney and the distant creak of settling beams. Inside, the girls set down their things. The rifle leaned against the door. The fox was placed gently back on the mantel. He didn't praise them. Didn't need to. Their breath came in sharp, proud little bursts. Their eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with certainty. He boiled water for tea. They sat close to the fire. "Are they gone for good?" the younger one asked. He looked at her, then past her to the window, where the snow had begun to fall again, slow and silent. "Maybe not," he said. "But we are not the same as we were." The older girl nodded. "We'll be ready." Later that night, he placed a new carving between them on the table. Not a bird. Not a fox. But a woman with her arms outstretched, holding a blanket open like wings. He didn't say who it was. He didn't need to. The girl stared at it for a long time. Then the younger one whispered. "She looks like someone who sees everything." The older added, "And someone who stays." They placed the figure beside the fire. Snow climbed the windows that night, but the cabin stayed warm. They slept without fear. Come morning, the sun would rise through a sky so clear it hurt the eyes. The drifts would glint like new coin. The fence, straight, mended, would hold strong. They had survived judgment, silence, and the threat of being forgotten. They had built something no court could see, no pen could name, and no rider could carry off in chains. And in the middle of the coldest winter, a fire still burned.